So I think we should start. Good afternoon, everybody. There's barely enough time with such a huge figure who's had such an amazing life story. Very unusual for a judge, I might add. Most judges are extremely dull. I speak as a former judge, and what makes them interesting is their intellectual life, but their lives aren't all that fascinating. And every life is valuable. But your life, my goodness. So this is Justice Moseneke, and welcome to Duke Law. I know you've been over here several times already, but what an honor to have this person of such great humanity here with us. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Levi. Privileged to be here.
Well, and you've written this wonderful book called My Own Liberator, and many of you probably have seen it. Maybe some of you have read it. I have read it, and with such tremendous enjoyment. Well done. This is a really great book. Tell us about the title.
Oh, okay. You started the difficult end, do you? Titles come usually at the end of a manuscript. You scratch and scratch your head, wondering, what am I going to call all this? And I left it to the end and thought, it's really about how you get out there and make sure that you liberate yourselves in multiple ways, at very many levels. The more obvious one being the duty I thought I bore to liberate myself from colonialism and apartheid. And I always understood that I am my own liberator. I'm the guy who's got to do it. Obviously, initially alone, together with others. So individual agency and collective agency intersect somewhere where you organize with others to resist a bad regime, but also you individually can outsource that obligation. And in the end, the line, drops somewhere. You are your own liberator. And there came the title, My Own Liberator.
What emerged to me from the title and from the experience was that because you had been your own liberator, when you moved to a constitutional democracy, you were able to, in one sense, leave the past behind and engage with people on current terms, as opposed to feeling the weight of this history on your shoulders. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. And really this was not original. Obviously I would have grieved 10 years on Robben Island at the age of 15. My captors were unkind. You found the details in the book. So it wasn't fun to be on Robben Island for 10 years as a juvenile, from 15 to 25 years.
It's a long time.
It's a long time. But I drew courage from the fact that Nelson Mandela was on Robben Island for 27 years, nearly 3 times my term. He comes out and says to us, his lieutenants, we have to spare our energy for the reconstruction. We've got to refocus on the reconstruction. In other words, migrating our society from a horrific past to hopefully a more just society. And that you're going to do by focusing on the quality of the transition, the mechanics of the transition, and the end goal, to reorder, to banish colonialism and apartheid and introduce a more just society. But more importantly, to be different from apartheid. So we would not reenact our unequal past. It didn't make sense. Spending all our times collectively being our own liberators and then immediately seek to do what apartheid was, which was bankrupt in many, many ways. So yes, I mean, one refocused on, as you'll notice, I'm not debating questions of forgiveness. We can debate that some other time. I'm not talking about forgiveness. I'm talking about the need to take the positive out of it, i.e. to reconstruct. And that's really what we did.
You mentioned Robben Island. Let's talk about that because it's such a big part of your history and confusing in a way because it was terrible, but you talk about the joy you experienced there as well. So you were arrested and convicted at age 15. How did that happen?
We were high school students. I understood very clearly, even from the age of 12, 10, just of the injustice of an unequal society, a separated and segregated society. And you need to be a victim of that to be able to take it in fully. But as a young person, I can't explain it why, but my sense of injustice was heightened. And I was appalled by the fact that my school precincts were so much poorer than the school precinct on the other end of the town. I was just totally unhappy that the two towns were different, unequal, and separate. And I was just unhappy that my people were kept completely out of any political activity. I didn't take much in the book. You remember I talk about being young and much older now with grandchildren. I would test them all the time with sweeties, which I would spread around unequally. Give you 3 sweeties, 5 sweeties, 7 sweeties, 10, give you nothing. And they'd come back. I have 6 grandchildren, 3 for my daughter, 3 for my son and their spouses. And they'll all come back to me, Grandpa, are you off your mind? You gave her 9 sweeties and you gave me nothing. I got 2, Grandpa. Why is he getting 7? What for? And it's fun because it just reaffirms my position that a distaste for injustice is native, is innate. It sits in all of us. And one day be kept out on account of how you look, your gender, your sexual orientation, whatever else, and you'll know just how it hurts. It's horrific. So it wasn't too much for me to decide my duty in life is to destroy apartheid.
So you were engaged with some of these student groups.
Political activities.
And you were swept up, and yes. 10 years is a very long time. You mentioned that the judge who sentenced you was later a judge, a fellow judge on your court, and you saw him having tea one day, but I don't think you interacted.
Yeah, that's true. Poor Piazzale, he was old then, he was tottering, and I was young and ready to go.
Yeah.
You know? I was in my 40s, was probably in his 80s, so it's quite a difference.
Yeah.
And I came in as sort of like the new young lion within a democracy, having defeated apartheid, and reconstruct a new society. And he was on the way out. And in the tea room, I saw him, gave him one look. And I thought, I'll have to gather courage to go and greet him. But I'm not going to waste my tea time on him.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Well, that's the kind of person you are. So on Robben Island, this was horrible for a young person. It was maybe even worse for your parents. You describe your father was just so saddened by this, and but you made the most of it.
Yes. Again, I don't know why, how, and where the insight came from, but my common sense was one, survival. 2, my mother and father were teachers, so I knew that I had to study. I was arrested in a high school. I was picked out of a class, so too my colleagues. So a natural instinct was to want to study. And we had to pick up a fight, as you know, 18-day hunger strike, and fight with the authorities and make sure that we have a right to study. which we earned. And voila. I mean, there are a number of features about Robben Island. Robben Island is a political prisoner facility only. So if you take 4,000, 5,000 political prisoners, put them together, you validate their position. We regrouped, and we started reassuring each other that in fact we're going to overcome, and that apartheid is bankrupt, stupid, it's mindless. Human beings are human beings. And that in fact we have to reorder our society and make it more just. So that energized us incredibly. And we set up, we often call it, as I say, a university on Robben Island. And we started a reading club and allowed us to order books from the public library. And of course, you know, Des Capital would have come running very quickly. Its translation in English, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. But in no time, reading became par for the course. You had a day of hard labor, those days where you're compelled to work for no pay, that's part of your sentence. 10 years with hard labor. So you work compulsorily. I describe how you push around stone, break up stones, get to the quarry, and so you end up, at the end of the day, you'd have a nice 3-4 hours of reading. And we had a relay, as I described there, of reading. You would take, an example would be Grapes of Wrath, and you remove the binding, and as I say, you push the pages, every 10 pages. I'll keep 10 pages, pass them on, you pass them on, and we read around in a merry-go-round of sorts. The book is done, and then we have a literary club discussion about a particular work. Or would pick up Anna Karenina and go and read Tolstoy or Dr. Zhivago. Okay, or so you would actually go and pick up books that we thought would speak to our circumstances. And indeed, I registered formally for a university after having qualified for university admission, college admission, while studying on Robben Island. So did others. So the place was turned into the authorities knew, but they did not quite plan for this. That we were actually preparing revolutionaries to have the tools to overthrow the apartheid regime. So in many ways, we turned it upside down. And I must say, I was young. I had no wife, I had no pet, I had no girlfriend, I had nothing. I had parents who were relatively young. So it was quite easier to focus on the job at hand, which is to do a degree, which, as you know, I did one in political science and English literature. Got it behind us after 3 years BA and got on to a law degree, and ultimately an LLB, which is an equivalent of a JD.
They wouldn't let you take graduate work, apparently, and so you could take a series of undergrad courses. And in the British system, law is an undergraduate major, so you did that.
Yes.
You took a degree in law.
Yes.
You remark in the book that during your time there, you were hungry all the time. I think even despite the hunger strike, that's a very long time, very long time not to eat. But you were a young person, you were growing, and they did not give you adequate food.
No, the food was terribly little. I think it was prescribed by the district surgeon, a government doctor, and that worked out how many ounces of sugar, how many fluid ounces of coffee, half a cup of oatmeal in the morning or meal. When you're 15, I don't know if some of you have teenagers in your homes. For a young boy and girl, you get into the refrigerator and you clean it out. And I used to do that before I was arrested. And I got arrested and suddenly 3 meals a day. Bang. No dessert, no cookies. I saw some cookies around, floating around. And you got 3 meals which are all measured. And every time after a meal, I felt so hungry. So what I remember about my 10 years on Robben Island is that teenage hunger. Every time after eating, my stomach was like empty again and was purring. Brrr, like, you need more food, and there was none. And I think if I had, I would have been twice taller than what I am now.
But even on the food, apartheid, you got more food depending on your race, less food depending on your race.
You know, David, it was a horrific system, totally horrific. Apartheid was meant to divide people from birth to death. Even the gravesites were different. Of course, the maternity halls would be different. Everything else in between was separated. So we get to prison and we find they give us a diet scale. You look at it, I know whether to start at the top or the bottom, but A diet was for white women, women of European extraction. B diet was for males of European extraction. C diet was for women who were classified of mixed race and or Indian or Asiatic. D diet was for Indian, mixed race, and Asiatic males. E diet was for African women, Aboriginal African women. And F diet was what I got. You can see how low in the rung I was supposed to have been, but that's how meticulous our oppressors were about notions of race and the immutable differences that human beings are supposed to have, and that you ought to take time and energy, but what's more, make laws, because apartheid was oppression by law. So this was in law. If you challenged it, they would produce a law act of parliament which says this is the food you give to African people. And this is what you give to white women who were called European women. So in Africa. But that was the whole range, and they continuously served food on that basis. So by the time you got to F, the food was so little, I thought I would die, just out of hunger. And we took an 18-day hunger strike, being hungry already when we started. So the transition was not that big after all. But actually the human body can take quite a lot of deprivation. We eat more than our body actually needs.
Yeah, it would appear. So you left Robben Island at age 25 with the determination to be a lawyer in an oppressive regime. You could have left the country, you could have done other things, but you chose to be a lawyer in South Africa. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, and the trend at the time was when people came out of Robben Island, obviously they would go into exile and join the liberation forces, armed forces. Remember, at a certain point after 1960, the decision was to embark on an armed struggle against apartheid, but also to brew internal insurrection. So there's going to be an internal uprising, and there's going to be an external military assault. Besides the diplomatic efforts, the anti-apartheid movement, which was quite strong even in this country. For that we are grateful, but certainly not in the mind of Ronald Reagan, who obviously supported the apartheid regime, or Maggie Thatcher, who supported the apartheid government. But certainly the people of the US themselves, and the UK and Europe, we had a strong support of anti-apartheid movements across the world. So it was a combination of all of those forces that would bring apartheid down. I chose to remain inside. And I chose that I would actually push the system to admit me as a practicing attorney. So I registered for apprenticeship. I wrote bar exams. And given all the impediments I had, I was first in my class nationally. I wrote bar exams, and I was better than everybody else who wrote it, and 99% were white. Applied for admission, So I didn't want any impediment that says you were second in class. Applied for admission as an attorney, and the Law Society objected. Amongst others on the ground that I'm an ex-con, and whether there is any moral turpitude on my part. And my argument was uncomplicated. No, I'm at the height of my sincerity. I seek to disestablish an unjust regime, the minority regime that oppresses the majority for reasons which are totally invalid. And no, I'm the good guy. Short of saying, Judge, you and your government are the bad guys, I'm a good guy. And fortunately, there was a precedent when Nelson Mandela was convicted in 1952 and was an attorney and argued, put up the same argument. So it wasn't quite my original argument. It was that there was no act of insincerity on my part. If anything, I was asserting my humanity and my right to be governed properly. Not in those words, but the three judges, as the three-panel judges, bought the argument, and I was admitted as an attorney. And then came to the point of practicing. Yes, I decided I'm going to practice inside South Africa. It was a complicated affair. Let's try and describe it. Every element of apartheid was through the law. As I said, it was oppression by law, not to be confused with the rule of law, because it wasn't. It was ruled by law. Parliament was sovereign, so Parliament could make laws to any effect. Like the example I gave you about the scale of food in prison, that laws that women earn only 2/3 of what men earned, for instance, under apartheid. Married women could not get permanent posts. Soon they'll be pregnant and they have to go away and you have to find substitute for them, and therefore the law prescribed that you don't employ women who are married. The whole range of intersectional oppressions that came out of all of this. It was a hideous system, actually. So, how do I practice law? And I wasn't original to this because there are a number of progressive lawyers, white South African, with progressive views, who also practice law within the same setting. So too are the black lawyers. And the strategy was uncomplicated, frankly. Every single time you seek to find a procedural foible or technical weakness, what I call the soft belly of the beast. If the rest of the beast is solid in its ramification, you're going to look at the soft end of it. And I can give you several fascinating examples of that. There's a law that permitted the government to remove African people forcibly from their homes without compensation. What I would do is to go and follow the trail of the proclamation. When was it issued? By whom? After which procedural process that had been followed? And was it gazetted? If so, in other words, published or proclaimed, was it done in time? Was it published in all of 2 official languages simultaneously? And you'll be surprised if you follow that whole chain. There's much between the cup and the lip that drops. And if you pick that up, because there's such a technical, rule-based lot, it's sufficient to set aside that particular order that sought to remove a whole community and hand over their land to white farmers or to white residents in the process of spatial apartheid or spatial apartheid. And we often would find that. I mean, one fascinating example, very quickly, an attorney who's an activist is arrested, called Richard Ramudipa. I say a little about it in there, you'll remember, David. And he gets detained in a prison, but the warrant of his detention under the Emergency Act said he must be detained in a police lockup. And I asked his wife, where is he? And he says, no, he's in a prison facility, a correctional facility. What? And I looked at the warrant again, and their principle says a warrant is something that limits the liberty of a citizen, and it ought to be construed in favororem libertatem, in favor of liberty. Not my principle, their principle. And rose in court and say, here is a warrant, improperly executed. Not only must you execute a warrant, write it out properly, as you implement it, you must implement it in strict compliance with its terms. And he was kept in a police lockout and not in a prison. And my lord, as we say, in my jurisdiction, not my honor. So you should be calling me my lord.
I'll be happy to.
The detention is unlawful. It's plainly unlawful. It's at a place. He could have been in this guy's chicken run. He could have been on his farm. He could have kept him in his motor car bonnet, whatever. So clearly, you must keep it at the place specified in the warrant. And he was released immediately. And he skipped the border and disappeared from South Africa. So that's an example of how you would meander your way through a blatantly unjust system and yet bring relief to your clients and to people who need the relief. And quite often, the second part was court cases were a platform for exposing the inhumanity of a system.
You use the rule of law against the rule by law.
Yes,
in
indeed.
one sense, yeah.
Yes, indeed.
So you went on to greatness as a lawyer. You took silk. You became a justice. You did some other things along that run. And I know you've written another book now about your time as a justice and as a judge. And it's not out yet, but we look forward to it. Why don't we? You had a relationship with Mandelas. You've mentioned Nelson Mandela. You haven't mentioned his spouse yet, but they were clients. They were mentors. Tell us. You're an executor of the estate.
Yes. Yes, for all my sins. In fact, this morning I got a letter from the receiver of revenue questioning whether Mandela had actually made certain bequests, whether he had actually paid out his children before he died, and whether that amount should not be subjected to normal tax, whether it's taxable in the hands of Nelson Mandela or in the hands of the heirs. Only this morning I got a note like that. I have to go and respond to that. Nelson Mandela was my father's age. He was on Robben Island in a section different from mine. I was in the general Vulgu section, the section, non-leader section, small little boy. But over time, I think he came to hear of me and I knew who he was. So by the time I came out and became an attorney and became counsel, I was one in a panel of lawyers that he often asked to do things for him. One of those was to look after Winnie Mandela and to defend her. And so did George Bizos, so did Arthur Chaskelson, who became our Chief Justice. So we're about 5 or so trusted lawyers. Excuse me. So I was in there. And my first task then was to defend in all of that turmoil Winnie Mandela, his wife, very, very beautiful wife, who was a freedom fighter of real note. She was quite a fiery human being. She was fearless, near totally fearless, and quite extreme in her views on many fronts. But be that as it may, it really meant that she would defy her banning orders quite often. In South Africa, there's something called a banning order where they restrict you to your home And she would get out there with her fist up in the air, and the police must arrest her, and the camera people are there, and TV cameras rolled, and so on. So it was my job to intervene, to appear in court. May it please the court, my lord, I appear on behalf of the defendant and apply for bail. And she would repeat that over and over again, and I would have to defend over and over again. So that got me quite close to the family. He was released, and I became one of his key troubleshooters. And that is why, in part, together with Arthur Chaskelson, were roped in to be the draftspeople for the Constitution. So as fate would have it, the one moment you are really a slave and saying, I'm my own liberator, I've got to liberate myself. The next moment you are a founding father. You know? And we had founding mothers too, by the way, in our country, unlike you. So we're founding mothers and fathers. And
they were invisible, they were there.
Oh, they just not mentioned the weather. Yeah.
Silent.
Okay. We have lots of founding mothers and fathers, but be that as it may, our task was to write down the deals that were struck in the negotiations and to write them in constitutional language and in ways that would encapsulate the agreements, but essentially to construct a democratic state. So I was invited by him personally, and therefore went out to write our interim constitution. It was a huge privilege from being a prisoner on Robben Island, and now I'm called upon, and we are voted upon by all the parties, and the parties felt I would have been one of the good guys to do this work. And thereafter, of course, I was invited by him, Nelson Mandela, to be the deputy chairperson of the Electoral Commission that ran our first democratic elections. So you can see the connection running there. And sadly, when he was to divorce with Winnie Mandela, I became Winnie Mandela's lawyer. We had a big fight about whose lawyer am I. Am I Nelson Mandela's lawyer, or am I? And she insisted I was her lawyer. And then I had to be on her side with the divorce, which was quite a sad moment. She hung around for 27 years and so on. And in the end, she lost out in the sense that our president had decided to divorce.
There was sort of I will call it amusing, maybe it wasn't at the time. She was a minister, and she broke a rule that he had, and...
oh, you read that?
Yeah. And you got caught up into this because he wanted to fire her.
Yes. I'd fired
They were still married.
Yes, it did. Immediately after the transition, Nelson Mandela, appointed his wife to be a deputy minister or associate minister in his cabinet. In a usual recalcitrant way, the rule was no cabinet minister travels abroad without the president's permission. Now, Mandela is a big chief. But in the interim constitution, because it was a transitional constitution, Mandela may not rearrange his cabinet without consulting F.W. de Klerk and Gatsha Buthelezi, who were sort of like deputy presidents. That's part of the compromise during the interim. Nelson Mandela heard that Winnie Mandela had gone to Ghana. And when she came back, he fired her point blank. Obviously, the relations had really soured between them, matrimonial relations also, and she was fired on the spot. And guess who get called up and woken up to to settle urgent papers, to seek an urgent interdict against the president. Now, I am now counseled to interdict the new democratic, president of South Africa, and who's Nelson Mandela, for whom I've done a lot of work. And Winnie insists that I've never been his lawyer. He was in jail, and I was always her lawyer, and I must do my duty. Which I did, and we settled papers and showed that, in fact, Nelson Mandela had not acted constitutionally. It was not difficult. The constitution was quite plain. You may not alter the cabinet without consulting the two. I got an affidavit from Gatsha Buthelezi that he had not been consulted, it was the end of the story. I think Haysom was acting for the president at the time. When they received the paper served on them, they threw in the towel, tendered to pay all the costs, and to take her back onto the cabinet, which was done summarily and publicly. We insisted that he must announce that he's going to re-employ her, because Winnie Mandela demanded that. She was fired publicly, and she wants to be re-employed publicly. Within 48 hours, the president followed the procedure that's required by the Constitution and fired her again. So we lost anyway, and we had no case this time around.
So you mentioned your role in the transition, which was, you had a huge role, and the two aspects that you highlight in your memoir are the oversight of the first democratic elections, and I'm sure that was just an enormous responsibility. And then the second was your role as a draftsperson, as Madison, a writer of a constitution. Maybe we'd take them in that order. So the electoral responsibility came to you from Mandela, and this was huge.
Yes, indeed, it was huge. Remember how I described how he followed me up into a bush camp and said, "I'm glad I found you, but you have to pack up." I was with my wife and children, and we had to stop the holiday and go and prepare to run the elections. Again, a big, huge privilege. And that came after writing the Constitution. Remember what we did, which is quite fascinating, and that's why the South African transition was so special. We agreed that we would do it, the transition will be within the purview of the law, and that we would draft Constitution in the form of legislation, and the minority apartheid government would basically have to swallow the pill. It will have to pass legislation, illegitimate and minority as it is, disestablishing itself and passing a law that would establish a democracy. So these parliamentarians went to agree to do that. It was part of the deal. Another way was simply to dissolve parliament in an anarchist way. Would have had no transition, most of the institutions would have been basically in a state of stress. We'd have had to start all over again. So what we did was to make sure that we have an orderly transition, and the minority would disestablish the apartheid parliament, and by law would say that from day X, this will be the new constitution of the country, and which will be interim until you have a final constitution. And also to set a date for the elections. So there we were set for elections. And again, elections were under law. So in many ways, because Mandela and de Klerk were lawyers, and we were lawyers ourselves, the lieutenant around him, this whole transition, which otherwise would have been bloody and dangerous, was encased in legal processes. And we adopted a Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms peacefully, within a setting that would totally disassemble apartheid. And so in many ways, it was an incredible achievement. And to therefore talk the same language, use principles of law in order to recreate an otherwise unjust society. And of course, the elections meant so much. Up to then, only 3 million white South Africans were entitled to vote. And in fact, we were a country of like 40 million, and 22 million adult Africans under the new constitution were entitled to vote. So suddenly you had to roll out the voting machinery to accommodate 22 million people. we didn't even have time to prepare voters' roll. So it was quite an operation. And to get, for instance, ballot papers printed outside of South Africa. I think we went to the United Kingdom and Canada. Somehow we didn't come to you guys.
You didn't want floating chads or what? Have some ballots left over from 2000.
Yeah, so, and your government at that time was not overly friendly, I think, towards what it called terrorist forces, us, who were trying to liberate South Africa. So in any event, there we were all set to run the elections. They were not perfect. I mean, some procedural elements were breached as we went along with the elections, but substantially they were free and fair, without a doubt. And Nelson Mandela emerged as president. So, in that sense, I was his vehicle, or part of his vehicle for becoming president, and vehicle of our people for establishing a democratic country.
And the legitimacy of the election was
And
critical.
the legitimacy of the elections was quite critical. And think about it, in 350 years, almost 40 years, it was the first time that we had a common voters' roll, ever since colonial times. And the first time South Africa had a Bill of Rights. It was the first time that we introduced a whole range of mechanisms that we can talk about in a law class anytime. When we introduced proportionality, when we introduced a whole range of tools to deal with a rights culture, and that we carefully spend time to write up and make sure that everyone can pick up the Constitution and just read it out. Mm.
So writing a 20th century, a late 20th century Constitution, that's quite a privilege. Did you have models that you were working with?
Yes. Yes, indeed, it is quite a privilege. I can't resist, of course, repeating Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's words. When the Egyptians asked him, where should we look to for a new constitution we might write? And she said, certainly not the US, but certainly South Africa or Canada. So we framed that, we put it up on every wall. She's always been a long friend of our country. In fact, she became justice in residence at our court many years ago. She came out to visit and was a justice in residence. So if you think I admire any justice, it's certainly her at this court, together with Justice Breyer, and more recently Justice Sotomayor visited us in South Africa. So they are part of our blessings when other people nodded and said, well done. But it was a constitution. We looked to the US quite hard, and there weren't many examples to find. I'm sad to say that to yourselves. Your constitution is very sparse. It says very little, actually, in relation to what we intended to say. It has been one of the oldest and the most veritable constitutions, but certainly not a modern constitution. And we looked a lot to Europe and to look at new constitutions in Europe, in Latin America, and the trend, and certainly in Canada, particularly the amendment of the chapter 3 on fundamental rights. The new trend is one to be explicit, to say it in the clearest terms what you seek to provide for. And the second requirement was that it will be in accessible language. You're going to pick up our Constitution and read it. It's bedtime reading. It's in accessible language. You don't need legal training to follow what it says. Very few arcane or, constructioned languages. The third thing were to make a number of decisions that were quite difficult. Let me talk about my area of work. the court, for instance. Will we have a Supreme Court? Yes, we will. Will it have judicial review powers? Yes, it will. And that's inevitable in the light of a Supreme Constitution. And what size of court will we have as a Supreme Court? 7, 9, 11. The Germans had 7 at the time. Other countries in Europe had 9, and others had 11. Canada had 7. They set mBank as 7, and we chose 11. And the second question was, will your justices be for life? Backwards and forwards debate. And we looked at the US experience and other experiences. So we had the benefit of hindsight. We're able to look at what people have done and decided that we will have a fixed term, the maximum of which will be 15 years. So I had to fall on my own sword because my 15 years ran out very quickly. And I had to leave the court, and that's why I'm here for an extended period, having recently retired. But I had to leave the court, and so did Edwin Cameron very recently, Justice Cameron. So did Justice Richard Goldstone. So all of us had to come off the bench, and we all felt energized and fiery and at the best of our intellectual ability. But we opted for renewal, and we recognize that judicial power is a vast power. And if you confer it to somebody for a lifetime, you've got to think quite carefully what you are doing. And we restricted the presidential term to 2 terms, like yourselves, that we copied from you, but 2 terms of 5 instead of 10. And the term for Supreme Court justices to 15 years, all told. So there was quite an anxiety to find renewal as well as limit terms in order to not confer security of tenure and invite abuse. And in that way, we got Nelson Mandela become the first president after the first term. He said, "Thank you very much," and he left. And he didn't run for the second term. So he was all the time trying to set good examples to all of us. He could have asked for a lifetime 10. Frankly, he would have got it. But he served 1 term and left.
Well, you had some remarkable people, and they took you through a transition that could have been very violent, and instead so remarkable. Should we open it up? Should we take some questions?
Yes, certainly. But before I do that, very quickly, I want to add F.W. de Klerk. It would be unfair not to. He bit the bullet. I mean, he announced that he was going to release Nelson Mandela. Huge chance, huge risk. He was going to unban all the political organizations. He was going to implore these organizations to enter into negotiations with him shortly after the Berlin Wall had come down, and the Cold War was tottering, obviously. It's coming to an end. And he wanted to take also full advantage of that. But at the same time, had he not done that, we would have gone through a bloody revolution, which was bloody in many ways already at the time. So I don't want to finish my little presentation without giving credit to him. He has had a few missteps. He talks out of 10. I think he's getting a little old. Other day he said he thought apartheid was not that bad after all. And that invited a lot of wrath from many, many people.
Sure.
But he's the man who decided to release Nelson Mandela. And the last point is Nelson Mandela could have said, "Let's murder them." And everybody would have done it. If he had given that order, would have had a bloodbath of no note. And obviously, state power would have been still in the hands of the white minority, and they had a lot of big guns. So they would have shot many people, but in the end we would have won, but with a lot of people dead. So F.W. de Klerk was quite an important factor in helping facilitate a peaceful transition. I just thought I'd add that footnote.
And today, how does it seem to you? Do you feel you have the rule of law? Do you feel you have a stable democracy with whatever problems you may have?
I'd say is yes. I mean, we've had 5 elections in a row. We have established institutions of state, and notably the judiciary, where I've worked for 15 years. And the jurisprudence is there for all to read and see. It's available. We've continued to receive justices from around the world to join us and to buttress and to support us and to validate us and so on. Most of the institutions went right until very recently. I don't want to expand on that. I'm sure there'll be questions on that. And we still struggle with the full extent of social justice, equality, and the historical excesses of apartheid, which is the inevitable intersection between class and race, and sometimes gender. That still haunts our system. And I can talk more about that if there are people interested in that. So the biggest trouble is not the democracy, it's working fine. The biggest trouble is eliminating poverty.
Questions?
I have to finish your story about F.W. de Klerk with what may have been the greatest underestimation of all time. My father, when I was a student in England, he used to write letters in those days. He wrote to me and he said, we've just got a new person on the board. His name's F.W. de Klerk, and I think he's a bit of a dope. This was, of course, before he became... I wish I still had that letter.
But historically, it turned out well.
Yeah.
He saved us a lot of bloodshed.
We have time for just one question, one special question. Go for it.
Justice Moseneke, you might have noticed, I'm not sure if you have, that there's a bit of a crisis of constitutional legitimacy in the general populace of the United States these days. As a successful constitutional draftsman and a founding father, what sort of actual advice would you give us as citizens of our country?
Yeah, there's an African adage that says when you are a visitor, your horns should be short. You know, people with sharp horns, animals with sharp horns normally go and fight other animals. So the saying says that when you're a visitor, please make sure your horns are not sharp, or your elbows are not sharp. I have to be careful here. I've been fascinated by how young Americans I've met in classes, and I've had the blessing of going to many interactive classes here, are exactly where you are. They're asking the kind of question that you are asking. Is it a time to reset? Is there a button that we can press to reset? I taught a class with Professor Levi, Marine Levi, on remedies, and we talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the students came back very much like you and said, what should we do? Did it work for you? And what were the moving principles, the animating principles? And what should America be doing to look into the mirror again? I know one of the candidates who I see on television does a lot of that, called Bernie Sanders. He calls up some of the edgy things that might be seen as symptoms of social injustice that still pervades your great country. We chose to look into the mirror. We chose to confront the inhumanity of our system. At Truth and Reconciliation, securocrats, military intelligence, police, what had to come up and say, I murdered her. I arrested her, I tortured her, I raped her, and killed her. Those activists disappeared, and we did this and that. They wanted amnesty, and the condition was that you tell the truth, fully and frankly, if you would like to get amnesty. And we created panels of judges to hear out the evidence and whether it is full and frank. And if it is, then you're entitled to amnesty. And that also is justiciable. If you thought they withheld amnesty unfairly, you could go to the court, right up to our court, to review the decision. So we had a system where people would come, and we had churches, for instance, who had killed nobody, but who would come and make submissions about how complicit they were with a system that basically annihilated the humanity of other people. But above all, that exploited them and rendered them significantly poorer, less educated, less healthy, and everything that apartheid brought to us. There's submissions around the capital punishment, for instance. The apartheid system executed people impulsively and almost compulsively. That's a habit. Execute black males, kill them. And almost unconsciously, they would sentence them to death every single time. And that's part of the work we had to do, being inside. I mean, to basically ward off people to be hung. In our system, you're hanged by your neck until you died. And that's how the warrant read. Because the judge has to specify the method of killing. And I see they do it in this country too. So we had to confront that. When we took over, we released 480 people in the death row. Because we smashed death penalty. So Americans have to go and find, I think, stigmata of sorts, those wounds that still show and that contort your society. For instance, it's quite remarkable that as a country of this prominence, you have no Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. They have been fed from a very thin platform on the world round. I mean, that have inducted and adopted charters of fundamental rights and freedoms, which were adopted after the Second World War right across the world. And they're old hats. I mean, that's what they are. But if you get here, so Americans have to go and find what are the things that might ameliorate. There are many wonderful and great things here, but what are things that ameliorate a horrific past? Maybe reparations? I don't know. Maybe a better, further talking about slavery and acknowledging what it really was and what it meant. America's relationship with women, patriarchy, sexual orientation. We dealt with each of these things and wrote them down in our Constitution. So it was not just about race. and took a position as a nation. Where are we on capital punishment? Where are we? So you won't find Roe v. Wade in my country, because we, by one decision, we made sure that women bear and the holders of reproductive rights, and they make the decision. So each of all those things that are still jarring, you may want to revisit them. It's a long answer, but I don't know what the actual answer is.
Thank you. We have to stop. We could go forever. It's such an honor to have you here. Thank you very much.